Have you ever lived beside someone for years and still felt completely alone? Have you ever woken up one morning, made your usual cup of tea, sat in a perfectly furnished kitchen, and no longer felt like you belonged there? My name's Lena. I'm Lena, a partner, a parent, a person navigating life in what looks like a peaceful home, at least from the outside. But inside, I've spent nearly 20 years of marriage carrying an emptiness I could never quite name. Until one day, a dog, Buddy, came to me, rested his head on my lap, and changed my entire world. This isn't a story about a dog. It's a story about how one quiet soul can save another simply by being there. If you've ever felt like you were slowly disappearing from your own life, stay with me. This story is for you. My name is Lena. I'm 42 years old, living in a small wooden house on the outskirts of Durango, a place where tall pine trees stand like silent guardians, sheltering the quiet life within. Each morning, my kitchen fills with light from the east-facing window. Steam trails from the teapot, tracing delicate lines across the glass, blending with the gentle scent of peppermint in the air. The breakfast table is neatly set. 3 white porcelain bowls, a slice of toast with almond butter for my daughter, a portion of oats for me, and a cup of black coffee, no sugar, just the way Mark, my husband, preferred. Mark always wakes early, leaves for work on time, speaks little and does much. He's a chief engineer at a major construction site in the center of town. He never forgets to take out the trash, never misses a bill. He's the model husband, at least by most people's standards. But to me, Mark feels like a room always filled with light, but never quite warm. We've lived together for nearly 2 decades, sharing a home, a child, a dog. But somewhere along the way, we stopped sharing ourselves. The silence between us didn't come from arguments or deep wounds. It came from stretches of stillness that grew too long. Dinners filled only with the sound of cutlery, questions like, "How was your day?" met with vague nods, and moments when he looked at me as if he were looking through me. I used to think it was normal, that this was just how it goes. Marriage, as my mother once said, is like background music. It doesn't need crescendos, just consistency. But what she didn't say was, when a song plays too long without melody, you begin to forget how it once made you feel. I felt increasingly invisible in my own home, everything in place, but hollow inside. I took care of everything, the cleaning, the cooking, my part-time job at the town library. But when the door closed at night, when my daughter was asleep, and Mark was lost in his phone or deep in sleep, I found myself alone, grappling with feelings I couldn't quite define. Then came Buddy, penny-colored golden retriever, a birthday gift from Mark, for our daughter's 9th birthday. Honestly, I never thought I'd grow attached to a dog. I'm someone who likes order. Buddy was chaos, fur on the rugs, muddy paw prints after the rain, and loud barking at every passerby. At first, Buddy clung mostly to our daughter. Mark was busy. I kept my distance. I saw Buddy as just another fixture in the house, like the old armchair or the plant on the porch, there but not needing much attention. But over time, I began to notice him. Buddy didn't speak. He didn't ask for anything. But whenever I washed the dishes, he'd lie down by the kitchen door. When I sat quietly on the porch, he'd come and rest at my feet. No calls, no explanation, just presence. Gentle, constant, like a whisper in a life filled with too much blank space. I don't remember exactly when I truly felt Buddy for the first time. Maybe it was one early morning when I sat alone in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, eyes blurred with a weariness I couldn't define. Anybody walked in, not rushed, not excited, just calmly came over and rested his head on my lap, as if to say, "I see you." It was such a simple act, but in a world where I was slowly fading, his presence left me breathless. No one had ever told me a dog could reflect my own loneliness. But now, when I look into those quiet brown eyes, I begin to realize maybe I've been walking too far for too long without ever asking, am I truly living or just surviving? It was a Tuesday morning, a morning that seemed entirely ordinary, at least at first glance. The sky was ash gray. The pine branches outside the porch swayed gently in the early winter breeze. And I woke up as usual, surrounded by the quiet of a house, long accustomed to the sound of Mark closing the door at 5:30. I walked down to the kitchen, placed the kettle on the stove, and looked out to the backyard. There were no voices, no hurried footsteps, just the misty light and Buddy lying across the porch steps, his head resting on his front paws, eyes quietly gazing toward the wooden gate. Something about the way he was lying there made me pause. I don't know why I opened the door. I just remember my hand turning the knob almost instinctively, letting the breeze slip inside and letting Buddy in. He didn't jump up, didn't bark, didn't scramble. He simply walked toward me, slowly, as if each step had already been considered. Then, when he was just a few feet away, he stopped and unexpectedly raised his head, gently resting it against my thigh. Just like he had the day before, in a way I hadn't forgotten. I froze, not because of the cold, but because it felt like my heart had skipped a beat. A feeling I couldn't quite name rose in my chest, something unfamiliar, yet hauntingly familiar. I reached out and gently stroked Buddy's head. His fur was soft and warm. Suddenly, I felt my eyes begin to well up. I let out a small laugh in my throat, shaking my head in embarrassment. He's just a dog, like, but beneath that casual thought was something deeper, a quiet undercurrent of feeling seen, approached, understood in a way I hadn't felt from a human in a very long time. After that moment, I never looked at Buddy the same way again. When he followed me into the kitchen, I pushed my. When he sat waiting by the window, I left the door open just a little longer. And when I made tea, I placed an extra small plate with a few slices of apple. Not for him to eat, but to feel like I wasn't entirely alone anymore. Buddy never asked if I was okay. But his gaze, his steady and silent presence offered a kind of comfort, deeper than any polite words of encouragement. From that morning on, something inside me began to change, not in a loud or dramatic way, but quietly, steadily, just like Buddy. I started to notice how he moved, carefully, gently, as if afraid to disturb the stillness of the house. I noticed how Buddy would lie beside the sofa, eyes still open, as if waiting for something he couldn't yet define. And I realized that perhaps the two of us, a woman and a dog, we were both waiting for the same thing, a reason to connect. The next day, I opened the front door earlier than usual. When Buddy walked up quietly, I didn't retreat like I used to. I stepped outside with him. It was the first time in years that I walked without a purpose. Not to go to the store, not to drop my daughter off at school, not to follow a schedule I'd laid out for myself. I walked simply to be present. And Buddy, as if he had been waiting for this all along, walked beside me, calm and steady. I didn't know what was beginning, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. We started walking every day, Buddy and I, like a new habit, but never a forced one. He never urged me to leave the house. He simply stood there at the door as if to gently remind me, if today you wish to be silent, then be silent with me. There's a narrow trail behind the pine woods that leads to a still lake called Pine Lake, a place that used to be our family's picnic spot when I was little. I hadn't noticed it before, or maybe I had just forgotten, but now these steady steps beside Buddy led me back to that place, as if guided by something unseen. Each time I stepped on the mossy ground and heard the dry leaves crackle underfoot, it felt like I was reconnecting with a part of myself, long buried beneath lists of things to do, people to care for. and a love that had gone too quiet. Buddy walked beside me in silence. Of course he did. And yet I felt that he could hear me deeply. So I started speaking, not out loud, not in clear declarations, but in murmurs, sometimes just a whisper. Today I feel tired. I think I've forgotten something really important. No one asks if I'm sad, buddy. At first, I felt ridiculous. A middle aged woman talking to a dog in the pine forest. But then something strange happened. The air felt lighter. My chest no longer clenched the way it did on mornings. When I would wake up feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the day ahead, I began to look forward to those conversations, even though no answer ever came. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower over the lake, Buddy walked ahead for a bit, then stopped and turned back to wait for me. The golden light reflected in his eyes carried a gaze I couldn't quite explain. Warm, solemn, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, and I, as if gently stirred awake by someone unseen, paused and looked into his eyes, feeling for the first time that I still existed in this life. After that moment, I began to live more slowly, not in the way people often describe minimalism, quitting everything, or moving to the countryside. No, I simply chose to pause within the life I already had, to look closely at a steaming cup of tea, to stand longer under the porch just to hear the wind pass through the roof tiles, and to let Buddy sit beside me as I wrote the first journal entry in years. Buddy became a slower rhythm in a world that had long swept me along too quickly. When I sat reading in the living room, Buddy would curl up nearby, never intruding, never asking for attention. His presence was like a soft undertone, like the distant resonance of a string instrument in a concert hall. Not loud, but essential. I can't remember the last time I truly had someone who stayed beside me without needing explanations, performances, or the illusion of being okay. But Buddy, the dog I once considered just a background member of our home, was the first in many years who made me feel I was not invisible. That connection held no words, no long conversations, no we need to talk, no condition. Just two beings walking side by side, choosing to stay without needing a reason. And it was in that silence that I finally heard what I had long ignored. A voice from within, faint but patient, like a small flame that had never gone out. When you live in silence long enough, sometimes you forget that it's not peace. It might just be endurance. I began to realize that on an early December evening. Mark came home later than usual, where he walked in with exhaustion on his face, his work gear covered in dust, a thick folder of paperwork in hand. I looked at him, still holding the spoon, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. Do you want to eat first or shower? I asked, like I had thousands of evenings before. I'll leave now, he replied, not looking at me, pouring himself a glass of water and sitting down at the table. I brought the food over, carefully setting the spoon, napkin, and some toasted bread beside his bowl, as if by doing everything just right, my emotions would somehow fall into place too. But as Mark ate and I sat across from him, gently tapping my spoon against the rim of my bowl, a strange emptiness swept over me. Not sadness, not anger, just an exhaustion that reached my core, as if I had been swimming too long in an ocean with no shore in sight. Suddenly I realized, how long had it been since we truly talked? Not about our daughter's schoolwork or utility bills or the car's maintenance schedule, but the questions that once nourished our relationship. How are you really feeling today? Is there anything you've been worrying about lately? Or simply, I miss you. The answer hit me like a wave. I couldn't remember. After dinner, while Mark went into his office, I stayed at the table, Buddy lying quietly at my feet, eyes gently closed. I looked at him, then at the barely open door. A thought flashed through my mind like a sudden jolt. What if it wasn't Mark who drifted away from me, but me who drifted away from myself? I began to remember the early years when we used to argue just to understand each other better. When Mark once came home early to cook dinner for me after a long day at work, when I used to leave little notes in his coat pocket just to remind him that I loved him. Now everything had become routine, and I didn't know when we stopped needing each other. That was a painful realization. But he lifted his head just as I was sinking into that stream of thought. He didn't come closer. He didn't try to comfort me. He simply looked like a silent mirror. In his gaze, I didn't see pity, nor expectation, only a quiet reminder. That night, I lay beside Mark in the dark. The space between our bodies was no more than a few inches, but the space between our souls felt like light years apart. He turned his back to me, his breathing steady, just like every other night. I lay still, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling and wondering, when did we lose our way? Thought about how I had changed, not all at once, but little by little. On the days no one was paying attention, I had grown quieter, expected less, asked fewer questions, and somehow Mark had become used to this version of me, like the one who didn't ask for anything. And I had forgotten that I still had the right to need someone. That night, I didn't cry, but I knew deep inside something had broken, not to end things, but to finally be seen. No more cover, no more pretending, only one clear, haunting truth. I felt disconnected from my sense of self within this marriage, and I didn't want to continue this way anymore. The next morning, I prepared breakfast like I always did, but inside, it no longer felt like every other day. What I realized the night before still lingered, like the bitter aftertaste at the bottom of a cool teacup. Mark sat across from me at the table, flipping through news on his eye, nodding slightly when I placed his coffee in front of him. I'll take our daughter to school today, I said softly. Thanks, he replied, eyes still glued to the screen. I looked at him for a few more seconds, and in that fleeting moment, I wondered, was it because he truly didn't know? Or had he grown so used to my silence that he no longer felt the need to care? Before I left the house, I glanced over at Buddy. He was lying in the sunlight, his eyes carrying a knowingness that somehow saw what was coming before I did. That afternoon, once the day's tasks were done, I made a simple dinner: vegetable soup, bread, a bit of grilled salmon, nothing fancy, but made with care. The warmth in the kitchen didn't just come from the stove, but from a quiet determination forming inside me. Tomorrow, I would speak to Mark, not to argue, not to blame, but to begin again. Honestly, when Mark came through the door, the scent of dinner filled the room. He smiled faintly. I was good tonight. I nodded gently. Thanks. Let's eat if you're ready. Dinner passed in our usual silence, but this time I didn't let it stretch too long. As he set his spoon down, I looked up, my voice trembling slightly. Mark, can we talk for a moment? He paused, glancing at me, a hint of surprise in his eyes. Maybe he wasn't used to my voice sounding like this, not sweet to appease, not sharp to confront, but simply an invitation, honest and vulnerable. Yeah, what is it? He replied, pulling his chair a little closer. I looked down at my hands, fingers intertwined. Look. Then I took a deep breath, trying not to let the words I was about to say turn into blame. I don't know where to start. It's just that lately, I feel like I'm disappearing. Mark frowned. Disappearing? What do you mean? I don't feel like I exist in this life anymore. Every day I do what needs to be done. I keep things tidy, take care of you, our daughter, but I no longer know who I am or what I need. He stayed silent, clearly unsure how to respond. I continued slowly, and then one day Buddy came over and placed his head on my lap. Like he could see me. No words, no need to understand everything. Just presence. Mark sat upright, his voice tinged with irritation. So what? You're saying a dog makes you feel more cared for than your husband? I shook my head, eyes still on him. That's not it. Buddy didn't take your place. He helped me rediscover parts of myself. Just made me realize how much I've been missing for such a long time. Not because you ignored me on purpose, but because I stopped speaking up too. And that's on both of us. Mark exhaled, leaning back, rubbing his temple with his fingers. I know, I've been distant. Work, pressure. I thought being responsible was enough, but maybe I was wrong. I looked at him, not searching for an apology. There's a glimmer of truth. I'm not blaming you. I just want you to know I need to feel seen, to be heard, not just on special occasions, but in the everyday moments. The way Buddy does. Mark lowered his head, and in his eyes, I saw something rare. Confusion, maybe even humility. Hmm, I don't know how to begin again, but if you still want to try, I'm willing to learn. I smiled, a small smile, but a real one. I don't need things to go back to the way they were. I just need to know I don't have to walk this alone. We sat there in a silence different from all the others, not suffocating, but gentle, as if after all these years, our home had finally cracked open a tiny window, letting in the first breeze of something new. After that evening, I didn't expect a miracle. I didn't wake up the next morning to find that Mark had changed. Everything still went on as usual. He left the house early. Work continued to take up most of his time. And our messages still revolved around things like, did our daughter eat breakfast? Or do you need anything from the store? But something had shifted, and it started with me. I began to reclaim the things that used to belong to me, the ones I had long forgotten. In the mornings, I no longer rushed to clean the kitchen, as if someone would discover I wasn't perfect. I made tea with the herbs I once loved back in college, chamomile with a thin slice of ginger. Then I'd sit under the porch, listening to Buddy chew on a branch or chase a fallen leaf without a care for the world. I started writing again. At first, just a few lines in a journal, no beginning, no ending, scattered thoughts, feelings without names. But once they were out, my heart felt lighter, as if something that had been stuck for a long time had finally found its way free. I also revisited the books that once moved me. There was a small poetry collection I used to carry through my 20s, now yellowed and carrying the scent of time. It was a line that stopped me in my tracks. You don't need someone to pull you out of the pit. You just need someone who will sit beside you and not let you fall. And I thought of Buddy, the dog who never promised anything, yet had always stayed beside me in the simplest of ways. In the afternoons, I'd walk Buddy around Pine Lake. The scenery hadn't changed, but something inside me had. Each step brought me closer to myself. I no longer needed to fix the marriage, nor did I feel the pressure to save anything. I just wanted to live in each breath, each moment, each silence that no longer felt empty. Mark began to notice, not in grand ways, but in small details I picked up on. He would ask what I was reading. He'd linger a bit longer after dinner, and sometimes he'd hesitantly ask to join me and Buddy on our walks, just for a few minutes. Still awkward, like someone standing just outside the world Buddy and I had built. I didn't want Mark to become someone else. I just wanted him to listen. And then I could feel that he was trying. I also began talking to my daughter more, not as a worried, controlling mother, but as an adult, relearning how to be present. We baked together, redecorated her study corner. One evening, while we were watching a movie in bed, she turned to me and whispered, "Mom, you've been smiling more lately." I hugged her tightly, quietly hiding the tear that welled in the corner of my eye. I was changing, not because someone told me but because I had finally touched what I truly longed for, to live as myself. Buddy is still by my side every day. He's no longer just the family dog. He's a friend, a mirror, a steady rhythm that reminds me, even in the darkest moments, sometimes all it takes is one sincere gaze to spark a flicker of light in a heart where I thought it had long gone quiet. Spring arrived late in the mountains of Durango. The snow melted slowly, revealing the first patches of grass along the path by the lake. The sky had shifted to a clearer hue, and each morning's light felt softer, no longer carrying the sharp edge of a long winter. Buddy and I still went on our daily walks. They had become an irreplaceable part of the day, but something had changed. Morgan started coming along. At first, it was just a few steps around the yard. He walked behind us in silence, hands in his pockets, eyes lost in the distance. But gradually, he slowed down and began walking beside me. Sometimes he would say a few words about work, about the article I was reading, or just a passing comment about Buddy. I think he knows we're talking about him. And I smiled, and not the words, but at his presence. We weren't back to how we used to be, and maybe we never would be. But something had shifted, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough for my heart to notice. The nameless distance at dinner was no longer there. The empty stares in the hallway had softened, and their place were eyes that paused and lingered. A simple question like, "Do you want to take a walk?" Or sometimes just a gentle touch on the shoulder. Small things, but real. One afternoon, while Buddy chased dry petals along the roadside, Mark stood watching me for a while, then said quietly, I still have a lot to relearn, but thank you for not giving up on me." I looked at him, then turned to Buddy, still prancing under the sun, as if the world had never known sorrow. I smiled and replied softly, "I'm also relearning who I am, and maybe that's enough." We didn't need a declaration. We didn't need promises of a perfect tomorrow. All we needed was today, a walk side by side, a breath drawn close, and an understanding beginning to take root in a place we thought had long gone dry. But he remained the quiet bridge between me and life. He asked for nothing, said nothing, and he was just there, gentle, steady, and sincere. And I realized some connections don't begin with conversation, but with silence. Some journeys don't need a destination, just the courage to take the first steps. That's back home to ourselves. If you've ever felt lost in the very house you live in, if you've ever been saved by the quiet presence of another being, you are not alone. Feel free to share your story in the comments. And if Lena's story touched something in you, leave a like, share it as a gentle reminder that each of us deserves to be seen, to be understood, and to be loved in the simplest way possible. We often move through life too quickly, forgetting that the gentlest things sometimes don't come from words, but from presence, a silent gaze, a quiet warmth beside us, or simply a head resting gently on our lap when we feel like we have nothing left to hold on to. For me, that presence came from Buddy, a dog who never spoke a word, yet helped me rediscover my own voice. The voice of a woman who had lost herself in the cycle of being a wife, a mother, and someone who always had to be okay. In Buddy's silence, I learned how to truly listen. And from that shift, other things began to bloom. a marriage that once felt cold, a husband who was also finding his way back to himself, and a home that felt warm again, not because it was complete, but because it was real. I won't say everything is perfect, but I can say, with all honesty, I've learned how to slow down, to see myself in the mirror, not just as a reflection, but as a feeling, to walk beside someone, not to get somewhere, but simply to walk together. If you're somewhere along that same journey, please know you're not alone. Some things don't need to be grand to change your life. Sometimes all it takes is a gentle touch and a presence that stays with you in silence, and that is enough. If Lena and Buddy's story touched something in your heart, feel free to leave a comment below. Have you ever had someone sit beside you when you needed it most without saying a word? Or have you ever been that someone for another person? Share your story, because maybe, just maybe, a few words from you could bring warmth to a quiet soul walking their own path. And if you believe in gentleness, understanding, and sincere connection, please like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We'll continue sharing healing stories like this together.